In 1977, a quiet London home became ground zero for one of the most chilling and controversial hauntings in history. From levitating children to ghostly voices captured on tape, the Enfield Poltergeist case has fascinated and terrified millions. Was it a hoax, a cry for help, or something truly otherworldly? We return to 284 Green Street, and the voice still echo.
In 1977, Enfield wasn't the London of luxury flats and fine dining. It was a tired, working-class borough, pulled thin by the weight of strikes, inflation, and a country teetering on the edge of economic collapse. Unemployment was high, garbage piled in the streets. The news was filled with words like austerity and unrest. And in the middle of it all were families like the Hodgsons, just trying to get by. Peggy Hodgson was a single mother of 4. Margaret was 13, Janet 11, Johnny 10, and Billy the youngest at just 7. They lived at 284 Green Street, a 2-story brick home in a line of nearly identical houses. The kind of place where every floorboard creaked and the wallpaper had started to peel at the corners. Life wasn't easy, but it was familiar, predictable. That would change on the night of August 30th. It was late, just after 9 p.m., when Peggy heard her children arguing upstairs. Nothing unusual. But the shouting turned into something else. Panic. "Mom! Come quick!" Janet screamed, her voice shrill. Peggy rushed upstairs to find Janet and Johnny in their bedroom, eyes wide, pointing toward the far wall. A large chest of drawers had moved, not tilted or bumped, but slid, several feet across the room. "I swear, Mum, it did it on its own," Johnny cried. Skeptical, Peggy shoved the chest back into place. She was about to scold them for scaring each other when it happened again. Right in front of her. The chest lurched forward, scraping across the wooden floor like it had a mind of its own. She stared at it, frozen. The air in the room had changed, heavy, dense, like the seconds before a thunderstorm. And then, the knocking began. Loud, deliberate bangs echoed from inside the walls, not random, rhythmic, as if someone or something was knocking back. The family barely slept that night. The sounds persisted, growing louder, more frequent. Shadows seemed to shift. Objects subtly moved. The children clung to Peggy, whispering that something wasn't right with the house. The next evening it escalated. Janet screamed from her bed. The knocking had returned, but now it was accompanied by a strange vibration, a low hum that seemed to pass through the walls. Beds shook, toys fell. A bookshelf collapsed in the hallway with no one nearby. Terrified, Peggy called the police. At around 1 a.m., 2 officers arrived. One of them was WPC Caroline Heaps. What she witnessed that night would become part of the official record. As she entered the house, the knocking resumed. Clear, sharp bangs on the ceiling and walls. But what came next chilled her. In the living room, a wooden chair moved. Not a wobble, not a tip. It slid, smoothly, several feet across the floor. No wires, no tricks. She inspected it herself. In her written statement, she later said, "I saw a chair move and I could not find any physical cause for it." Peggy expected answers. Instead, she was met with silence. The officers left, disturbed but helpless. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something the law could arrest. The following morning, desperate and afraid, Peggy reached out to the press. A photographer and reporter from the Daily Mirror arrived, skeptical but intrigued. They interviewed the family, took photos, and waited. At first, nothing, but then came the familiar knocks. slow and deliberate. A picture frame fell from the wall. The photographer snapped to attention. Suddenly, a Lego brick shot across the room, striking him in the face. It left a visible welt. Something, or someone, had thrown it. The Mirror published the story the next day. The House of Strange Happenings. Readers were divided. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others were captivated. And more reports began to surface, of further activity, of more witnesses, of unexplained phenomena. Inside the house, the fear continued to build. Janet claimed she was pulled from her bed. Her siblings watched it happen. Not once, but multiple times. Doors slammed, furniture tipped. At one point, Peggy found her kitchen flooded with water, with no visible source. Appliances malfunctioned. The dog refused to go upstairs. Then came the voices. Late at night, Janet would speak, in a voice that was not her own. Deep, male, rough. She said she didn't remember doing it. Her siblings backed her up. Even Margaret admitted it wasn't her voice. It wasn't her at all. The haunting had become something more than strange sounds. It had taken on a personality, something with intent, with memory, with anger. Peggy reached her breaking point. She had tried the police. She had gone to the press. Now she turned to the paranormal. Because whatever had entered their home, it wasn't leaving quietly, and the knocking was only the beginning. Within days of the Daily Mirror story hitting the press, help arrived, though not from where Peggy Hodgson expected. Maurice Grosse was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, not a ghost hunter, not a TV personality. He was an engineer, practical, methodical, but his interest in the paranormal wasn't academic. His daughter had died suddenly in a motorcycle accident, and since then, he'd been seeking proof that death wasn't the end. He came with tape recorders, thermometers, notebooks, and microphones. Not crystals, not Ouija boards. He was there to observe, record, and investigate. He met the Hodgsons, introduced himself, and quietly began logging what he saw. Strange noises, cold spots, doors that creaked open on their own, furniture that shifted. He even watched a heavy curtain twist itself around Janet's neck, with no one nearby. But then, something new began. Janet started speaking, or rather, something started speaking through her. At first, it was a whisper, a scratchy, hoarse voice, low, masculine, and completely unfit for an 11-year-old girl. Then it grew bolder. It spoke in full sentences. It cursed. It joked. It answered questions. "I'm Bill," it rasped. "Just before I died, I went blind. Then I had a hemorrhage and fell asleep, and died in the chair in the corner downstairs." Grosse stared. The room was silent. Then Janet blinked, seemingly unaware of what she'd just said. Her sister Margaret confirmed it. Janet would drift off, eyes unfocused, and begin talking in a voice that wasn't hers. The transformation was unsettling, not just in tone, but in presence. Something else was in the room. Grosse called in reinforcement Guy Lyon Playfair, an author and fellow SPR investigator. At first, Playfair was deeply skeptical. He suspected attention-seeking behavior, trickery. He came to disprove the case. But by the end of the first week, he was rattled. The phenomena intensified under observation. More bangs, more voices, more objects launched across the room. Playfair was hit in the leg by a small metal object while writing notes. He saw furniture lift. He heard knocking that responded, intelligently, to questions. They set up microphones in every room, hoping to capture definitive proof. They recorded over 180 hours of audio. Most of it featured the same voice, the same entity. Bill. The voice was gravelly, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry. It claimed the house as its own. It called Gross an old sod and told Playfair to sod off. But in between the taunts, it said things that chilled them. "I'm not gone," it whispered. "Just changed." Gross and Playfair searched the archives. They discovered that a man named Bill Wilkins had once lived and died in that house. According to death records, he'd suffered a cerebral hemorrhage while sitting in a chair in the living room. The exact details the voice had given. Skeptics said it could have been learned from local gossip, that maybe the family had known. But the Hodgsons denied ever hearing the name. The investigators remained convinced it was far too specific to be coincidence. To test the voice, they brought in experts, audio engineers and speech therapists. One expert said that while it was physically possible for a child to produce such a voice, it would cause vocal cord damage within minutes. Janet sustained it for hours, and not just once, but over weeks. To rule out ventriloquism, they asked the voice to speak with Janet's mouth full of water. It did. In one session they asked, "What do you see?" "I see through Janet's eyes," the voice answered. And when asked what death was like, "It's cold, and I'm still here." Multiple personalities began appearing, other voices, less coherent. But Bill remained dominant. He spoke of the house as if he never left it. Skepticism still lingered. Janet was caught on occasion bending spoons and pretending objects had moved. She admitted it. "I wanted to see if they'd notice," she said. "But most of it wasn't me." Playfair didn't deny the hoaxes, but he argued they were minor, childish mischief amid genuine terror. And even when Janet was removed from the house, placed under observation in a hospital room, the activity continued. Objects vanished, notes were torn. Staff observed strange disturbances, but no one ever caught her in the act. One night, a doctor left a notebook in her room with a sealed cover. In the morning, pages were missing. No signs of tampering, no explanation. Playfair, a skeptic turned believer, began writing down everything. Gross rarely slept. The family was fraying under pressure. Journalists came and went, debunkers, spiritualists, neighbors. Everyone had an opinion. But inside 284 Green Street, something was still talking. And on the tapes, it was very much alive. The house on Green Street had become a war zone, not just between the living and whatever was haunting them, but between believers and skeptics too. The more strange things happened, the more outsiders wanted a piece of the mystery, and nowhere did this tension explode more than with one now infamous photo, a girl flying through the air. The photo shows Janet, arms spread, mouth open, hair lifted, caught midair in what appears to be levitation, not jumping, not falling, floating. It was captured using a time-lapse camera that Maurice Gross had set up in the bedroom, triggered automatically at intervals during the night. And it wasn't just one image. There were several, Janet in midair at unnatural angles, her body twisted in ways that didn't quite make sense. Often her sister Margaret would be in the background watching with wide eyes. To Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, this was proof. Physical, photographic evidence of something beyond explanation. But to critics, it looked like a well-timed jump, a child bouncing on her bed. Playfair pushed back hard. He said the photos didn't show the usual signs of motion. No blur, no arc, no spring. And besides, who jumps with their arms limp, their eyes closed, and their feet pointed downward? Still, for many, the explanation was simple. She jumped, the camera caught it. The skeptics weren't convinced, and now neither was the media. As the story spread across Britain and beyond, the house became a magnet. Paranormal investigators, journalists, skeptics, thrill seekers, They all came knocking. The BBC sent a crew to document the haunting, but as soon as they arrived, their cameras malfunctioned. Fuses blew, lights failed, their audio cut in and out. They left empty-handed. It became a pattern. Equipment that worked outside the house would fail inside. Cameras jammed, batteries drained, recordings were erased. Skeptics called it coincidence. Believers called it interference. Then came the tabloids. "Hoax," screamed one headline. "Possessed by fame," said another. The media frenzy brought pressure, and that pressure turned to scrutiny, especially for Janet. She was examined by psychologists, interviewed on national television. Her every gesture was dissected. Was she lying, acting, craving attention? She was still just 11. Eventually, she cracked. Under mounting pressure, Janet admitted to playing tricks. A few. Moving objects, making noises, pretending sometimes. But she was adamant. Most of it was real. I didn't start it. I couldn't stop it. It was enough. The skeptics pounced. "She confessed," they said. "Case closed." But Gross and Playfair disagreed, loudly. "We never said every moment was genuine," Playfair told the press. "But if even 10% of it was real, just 10%, then we have something truly extraordinary." The haunting had become a circus. And the Hodgsons? They were the unwilling stars. The family began receiving offers, money, TV deals, book contracts. They turned most of them down. Peggy just wanted her children safe. She wanted peace. But the haunting hadn't stopped. If anything, it had evolved. Janet remained the epicenter. Wherever she went, things happened. Lights flickered. Objects moved. One night, she was reportedly dragged across the floor by an unseen force, right in front of her siblings. To de-escalate things, Janet was placed in a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. Doctors ran tests, interviews, observations. They found no signs of psychosis, no schizophrenia, no multiple personalities. She was a bright, if stressed, 11-year-old girl. While she was gone, the house was quiet. But when she returned, it all came roaring back. Even journalists who came expecting to debunk the family began to change their tune. Some had witnessed too much. Cold spots, inexplicable noises, physical objects flying across rooms. And that voice, the guttural, rasping growl that still spoke through Janet. Some skeptics began to soften.
For my complete name, Morris Gross. See if you can do that.
It may have started as childish mischief, one psychologist admitted, but something else is happening here. Among the phenomena documented were marbles hurled across rooms, bouncing without rolling, as if tossed, but leaving no motion trail. Books launched from shelves with force beyond any child's strength. Water puddles appearing in dry rooms with no broken pipes or leaks. Beds shaking violently while multiple witnesses stood by, paralyzed. None of it made sense. Not all of it could be explained. And that was the most unsettling part. Because if even one of those things, just one, was real, then the rules of reality had been bent, if not broken. The investigators continued their work. Gross barely slept. Playfair wrote detailed journals. The family soldiered on, exhausted, confused, isolated. People outside the house debated theories, but inside, it wasn't a theory. It was their life. And Janet, she stayed in the eye of the storm. Was she the cause, the victim, the medium, or had something found her and refused to let go? No one knew, but the voices were still speaking, and the house was still listening. By the spring of 1979, the chaos at 284 Green Street began to fade. Slowly, subtly, the banging ceased. The chilling voices grew quiet. No more levitations, no more objects hurled across rooms. There was no final confrontation, no climactic ritual, just silence. It was as if whatever had taken hold of the house had grown bored or satisfied and slipped away, leaving behind a strange emptiness. But silence is not the same as peace. Peggy never moved. She continued raising her children in that same modest home. The house that had once shaken to its foundations under invisible hands was now just brick and wood again, normal, on the outside at least. She said the activity diminished after a priest came to bless the house. Not an exorcist, not a spectacle, just a quiet man with a prayer and a cross, walking room to room. No cameras, no headlines, and then calm. But the damage had already been done. Janet entered her teenage years with the weight of the haunting still clinging to her. She tried to return to normal life, but the media refused to let her forget. TV interviews followed her. Reporters asked the same questions again and again. Was it all a hoax? Did you fake the voice? Were you just a child seeking attention? She answered carefully, trying to protect herself, but her story never changed. It wasn't all me, she said. Not even close. The haunting had brought no rewards. The family didn't profit. There were no Hollywood deals, no fame, only trauma and the ridicule that came with it. Janet was bullied at school, laughed at, mocked, called the ghost girl. Behind closed doors, the family struggled with anxiety, isolation, and the long, complicated process of moving forward. Meanwhile, Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair didn't stop. They documented everything, hundreds of pages of notes, photos, and transcripts. They cataloged over 180 hours of audio, recording the phenomenon as it unfolded. Eventually, Playfair published This House is Haunted, a meticulous account of the events. It became one of the most widely studied hauntings in British history. The Society for Psychical Research stored the evidence, official police statements, witness testimonies, tape recordings. A massive archive, still referenced, still debated. Until his death in 2018, Playfair never wavered. I didn't want to believe it, he said in later interviews. But I couldn't ignore what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Skeptics held their ground. They cited Janet's pranks, the pressures of fame, the psychology of suggestion. But even among skeptics, there were quiet concessions. There are pieces of this case, one parapsychologist admitted, that just don't make sense. They don't fit any model I know. Janet eventually moved away, got married, had children of her own. She tried to leave Green Street behind, but the story never left her. When asked years later if the haunting had truly ended, she paused and said softly, "It still lives with me." Even decades later, no one agrees on what happened at 284 Green Street. Some call it Britain's most compelling ghost story. Others call it the most successful child-led hoax of the 20th century. And in between those extremes lies a question that still haunts investigators, skeptics, and the family themselves. What was it? One theory points to poltergeist activity, a term rooted in German folklore meaning noisy ghost. Paranormal researchers have long connected poltergeist cases with children, particularly adolescent girls, often under emotional stress. The energy, they say, doesn't come from the dead, but the living. Psychic pressure building up and exploding outward in chaotic physical ways. This theory fits a pattern: the divorce, the instability, Janet's age. If true, it would make her not a possessed victim, but the source of the energy, unwittingly manifesting destruction with her mind. But even if that explains the banging, it doesn't explain the voice. Speech experts analyzed hours of recordings and concluded that the Bill voice came from false vocal cords, something extremely rare in children. It should have caused vocal strain, even injury. Yet Janet used the voice for hours on end, for weeks. No hoarseness, no signs of damage, just that same deep, gravelly presence, always waiting to speak. So skeptics adjusted the theory. Maybe it was dissociation. Maybe Janet was experiencing trance states, inventing another identity as a way to process trauma. Some even suggested early schizophrenia, though doctors found no clinical evidence of it. But again, this fails to explain the physical events. A chair slid in front of trained police officers. Lego bricks flew across rooms and struck journalists. Water appeared in dry places without explanation. Metal objects launched with impossible speed and force. Even Playfair himself was hit. These things were observed, documented, even filmed. Not just by believers, but by skeptics, journalists, engineers, and ordinary people. Then there's the hoax theory. Simple, elegant. The kids made it up. The mother went along. The investigators were duped. Maybe the voice was practiced. Maybe the levitation photos were just well-timed jumps. Maybe the whole thing was an elaborate game that spiraled out of control. But this version assumes near supernatural levels of planning, endurance, and acting skill from a group of impoverished children and a stressed-out single mother, sustained for nearly 2 years under relentless public and media scrutiny. And it assumes that everyone who entered the house, police, priests, engineers, and scientists, failed to spot the con. If it was a hoax, it was one of the most successful in modern history. Then there's the paranormal theory, the simplest and most chilling, that it really was a spirit. That Bill Wilkins, the man who died in that house, never left. That something intelligent, even malicious, had latched onto Janet and made itself known. That she was not faking, but channeling. Not acting, but possessed. When asked why he haunted the house, the voice said simply, "Because it's mine." And then it stopped. No matter the theory, no one can account for everything. Not the hours of responsive knocking, not the cold spots measured on thermometers, not the levitations caught on time-lapse cameras, not the questions answered by a voice that claimed to remember dying. It's this lack of resolution that keeps the Enfield case alive. It refuses to be boxed in. Every explanation raises new questions. Every debunking leaves something behind. That's why parapsychologists cite it as a landmark case, one of the few with dozens of credible witnesses. Police officers, journalists, clergy, all of them reporting events they couldn't explain. Over 30 people across 2 years, watching the impossible unfold. Skeptics, meanwhile, remain firm. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, they say. And Enfield, with its grainy photos and scratchy tapes, simply doesn't deliver. But Enfield was never about clean evidence. It was about fear, witness accounts, voices in the dark. It was about what happens when reality slips, just a little, and something else gets through. Maybe it was all in their heads. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe Janet was traumatized. Maybe she was gifted. Maybe she was both. Or maybe, in a quiet house in North London, the impossible really did happen. And maybe, just maybe, it could happen again, because belief and disbelief aren't that far apart, and sometimes the truth hides in the space between. A house is just brick and wood, until it starts talking back.
At 284 Green Street, the walls whispered, furniture moved, voices rose from the throat of a child. Whether it was a hoax, a haunting, or something in between, it left a scar across the living room floor and across the minds of everyone who stepped inside. Have a good evening, mortals, and until next time. The house is gone now. What remains is an empty lot behind a chain-link fence. Its grass, the same pale green as every other yard on the street. The plywood, the graffiti, the smell, all erased in a single day of demolition. Until next time, mortal, this has been Tapes of the Lost.